Hi, this video is going to cover some of the topics that we did not have time for at class. It's going to start with the topic of memory forgetting. Some of the classes didn't have a chance to see that. And we'll take that, and there's also some discussion of how memory is actually reconstructed when we recall events and errors in memory as well. And it'll finish off with just a few suggestions in terms of improving memory. So let's go to the outline. Okay, let's see. We'll bring up the outline here. And there we go. Now, most of us find forgetting to be aggravating, to be annoying, but consider that forgetting may actually be beneficial. In fact, it prevents us from being constantly aware of intrusive memories, things that we would not want to remember most of the time. And it also keeps us from being overwhelmed by useless trivia, all of the things that we encounter that really don't matter. If this information had to remain within our consciousness and that we could not put it out of our mind, this would actually be very annoying, and very quickly we'd experience cognitive overload. In fact, that's exactly what happened to one fella. This guy would do exhibitions of his amazing memory feats, and he could look at a page in a phone book, and then he could recite all the names and phone numbers, even with a brief glance at all of them. People were amazed, but the problem turned out to be that after a time, all of that useless trivia began interfering with his normal thinking processes and cognitive processes. He could not put it out of mind. So forgetting actually does benefit us. Now, that said, whenever we have difficulty retrieving information, it's usually due to one of three things. It's either due to poor encoding, we didn't get the information into the memory system to begin with, or the information was stored insufficiently, poor storage of that information, or there is a problem with the retrieval of the information which actually is stored. Encoding failure indicates that we can't remember what we don't encode. When people were shown the penny, the card with the pennies that you see there, they were told that there was only one correct penny, the rest of them had some sort of error, and only about 4 out of 10 people were actually able to identify the correct penny. The rest, more than half, didn't know. And you say, well, why don't we know? We encounter pennies very commonly. In fact, though, most people don't know because we don't sit around and study what's in that penny. We don't encode that, bring it into our memory system. We say, well, you know, if it's round and it's about the right size, good enough for us. Now, that said, if we show that to a coin collector who makes their living at that, they'll tell you right away. In fact, they study that, they do commit that to memory, how the penny should look. And so those individuals have encoded and stored that information. The rest of us probably not. It's just a penny. By the way, I don't know which one is correct. You'll have to go to your textbook. I don't even know. Who cares? It's just a penny. Another reason we may have difficulty recalling information is storage decay. And the durability of stored memories is somewhat dependent upon reactivating those memories. The memory traces, many theorists believe, begin fading if they are not periodically reactivated. And this is consistent with Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. You might remember Ebbinghaus tested his memory over various time periods, and what he found is, having learned a list of words perfectly within one day, there was a decay of almost 2/3 of what he learned. He was left with only 30% of what was originally known, and that memory decay continued quite rapidly for a couple more days and then leveled off. The basic pattern then is storage decay happens most rapidly immediately after learning something, and then after a time levels off. But we do see this happening, and we're left often with only a fraction of what we originally knew. And so if you're in the habit of, say, reviewing things immediately before a test, actually that is a good practice, because as this shows, once we've studied something, even if we knew it, that information does begin to fade fairly rapidly in the early stages. Although the more times we've gone over information that we know, the less that this forgetting curve is going to get in our way. So you can somewhat overcome it by doing a lot of review. Retrieval failure is another common cause of inability to remember forgetting. And although the information is retained in our memory store, it cannot be accessed at that particular moment when the person wants it. Usually retrieval failure is related to a lack of retrieval cues to activate that memory. And such is the case often with the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Maybe you're trying to remember somebody's name and you kind of know how it goes, but you just can't get it. It's on the tip of your tongue. Maybe you even sort of know the inflection. It kind of goes, you know, whatever. But you can't think of it. In fact, this may be a lack of retrieval cues for that at that moment. I had this happen to me one time. I was coming out of HEB, and there were some people that I recognized in the parking lot, a couple coming towards me, and I said, oh, I know them, but I can't think of their names. And you know how you kind of try to avoid people when you can't think of their names because you don't want to be embarrassed. But I couldn't, because I was going the same direction. They were coming towards me. And so when they got close enough, I said, oh, yeah, I know you. I can't think of your names. And they said, oh, yeah, well, we know you from church. And I said, oh, right away. Yeah, the name came back to me then. In fact, I was seeing them in a very different context than I was used to, different cues. And in fact, they were dressed differently, doing different things, different behaviors than you would see at church, and in an entirely different surroundings. And therefore, I had difficulty accessing the name. But when I put it together with what I saw them doing at church, the name came back to me. It's real common. So retrieval cues are important. The more retrieval cues we have, the more readily we're going to be able to retrieve the information. Interference also can prevent us from retrieving information that we may have stored. And this is the case in the picture you have here. We have a student who is studying French and Spanish in back-to-back classes, and it just so happens that some words in Spanish are similar to words in French. Maybe not a lot of them, but a few of them anyway. So interference can prevent her from retrieving what she learns in one of those classes. And this can be proactive interference. In other words, information going forwards from the first class can interfere with retrieval of what's similar information learned in the second class. So she goes to take her Spanish exam, and what's learned in the French class earlier than that interferes with retrieving the correct words in Spanish. Proactive interference is one form of this. By the way, maybe a way that you've experienced this, if you had to change your password for something and provide a new password, in fact, you may find that the old password interferes with you retrieving the new ones mentally, at least for a time, until it becomes a habit, and you have a tendency to want to mix the two together. Now, We also have retroactive interference. Newer information interferes with older information, and indeed the student also may have trouble with her French exam. Why? Because the things learned in the Spanish class that were similar to the French class, now going backwards retroactively, are interfering with the correct word in French. Now, that also may be something you've run across. Maybe you had to fill out a form where they asked you for your previous address, and you just say, oh my gosh, I should know this, but I can't remember that old address. You have memorized a new address. Now the new information is interfering with you recalling your old address. Maybe you've heard that sleeping after you study something will help you to recall it later on, and research indicates that's actually true. Subjects who were asked to remember a list of syllables, some of them were allowed to sleep after learning the syllables, and others were forced to stay awake. We're not allowed to take a nap. And here's the results. Notice that hours elapsed after learning the syllables. Those who got to sleep afterward retain a significantly more information. In fact, it almost seems to be double and triple the amount of information. Many researchers suggest the reason that people retain more when sleeping after studying something is because there is no new information entering the memory system, or at least not very much when we're sleeping. And so this prevents the interference effect. So now you have an actual excuse to take a nap after you study something, and indeed it can help you to retain that information. By the way, you may have heard the best time to study something important is to study it and review it right before you go to sleep, right before you go to bed. And again, that's consistent with these findings. Now, sometimes it's possible that people may not remember things because they're motivated to not remember it. Motivated forgetting, in which people unknowingly revise or limit their memories. It's suggested that this is potentially something that is done unconsciously. That was the position of Sigmund Freud, who was the originator of the psychoanalytic theory, psychoanalysis, that we learned about in chapter 1. Freud believed that we frequently repress frightening memories, or memories that would cause us significant anxiety, and he believed this to be a defense mechanism, defend ourselves against undue anxiety. Whereas Freud thought this is common, modern memory researchers have difficulty producing repression in experimental conditions, and many of them, for that reason, believe that this is something that really doesn't happen, although there's some arguments. Clinical psychologists, on the other hand, who work with people, might say that in their experience they have encountered individuals who seem to have repressed memories that were troublesome to them. So we have some differences of opinion. What we do know is if repression does occur, it's relatively rare. It's not very common at all. Even though the public tends to believe that, it's a widespread belief, but it's not warranted by the facts. It seems to be rare if it occurs at all. Now, we can also then consider why we forget by looking at information processing theory. And as we look at how information is processed, forgetting occurs at each stage of memory. So starting from the very beginning, well, before information can even reach sensory memory, we have to pick up that information with our senses. And so if an event was occurring and we were looking somewhere else, or we didn't hear what that person said, we're not going to be able to remember it because it didn't even make it into sensory memory. Now, much information enters sensory memory, an amazing amount of detail, so we do have a lot of information coming in there about various events, but only a portion of that then reaches short-term memory. Only those things that we notice, that we select to attend to and encode. Once things reach short-term memory, in fact, some of those things may be altered as we process that information. Maybe we think about it and say, well, I think it should have been this way, and we actually alter the information that we're holding in short-term memory. But at any rate, only a fraction of what enters short-term memory now is going to be encoded into long-term memory. And most items are going to simply fade away from short-term memory, not make it here, although things that are significant to us may actually make it. But notice now we're down to a tiny fraction of the original information. And then we go to retrieve whatever information we do have stored about that event. And now other forces come into play that limit what we actually retrieve. If interference is occurring, we cannot retrieve certain information, or if we lack the proper retrieval cues, or if we're in now a different mood than when that information was stored, or if we're motivated for some reason not to remember it, then we're going to retrieve even less. So we're left with only fragmentary memories of that event, fragmentary information. What researchers now have learned is that whenever we retrieve a memory of something, we are actually reconstructing that memory anew. We filter, we fill in missing pieces of information unconsciously. We don't realize that we're filling them in. And much of the time, what we fill in is good enough that we don't notice a problem. It fits with how things actually were. But that said, what we fill in may incorporate what we imagined. It may incorporate what we expected to see happen or hear. It may incorporate what we saw or heard after the event, such as someone else giving an account of that story. So what we end up with is potentially a memory that incorporates some corrupted information. In fact, the misinformation effect is that misleading information can be incorporated directly into our memory of an event. This was shown in research done by Loftus. In one of their studies, the participants viewed a video of a car collision, and the cars were going relatively slow. Then half of the participants were asked the question, how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other? The other half, the question was, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Any guesses as to which group estimated a higher speed? If you guessed the group that heard smashed in the question, yes, they did. They estimated the cars to be going faster, and they were also more likely to remember glass being broken in the accident when in fact on the video there was no broken glass. So you can see just subtle change of words within the question was enough to pollute their memory of that event. They had no idea that they had been influenced in this way, but it was quite effective in altering their memory of the event. This is what we call the imagination misinformation effect. Now, also imagination effects are very significant as well. In one study, subjects were asked to imagine that they had moved a stapler from a desk to a table. They actually thought they were there to do math problems, which they did. When called in to complete the experiment a few weeks later, they were asked about moving the stapler. And almost half of the participants actually believed that they had physically moved the stapler, when in fact, initially, they only imagined that they had done it. So what we imagine can become reality to us. Now, if inaccurate information then creeps into our memory of an event, as we retell the story, then the inaccuracy may continue to increase, and we may become more and more convinced that that is actual accurate information. The confidence increases, but the accuracy may continue to decrease. And real and imagined information, therefore, becomes difficult to distinguish, both for the person investigating the person's story as well as for the person themselves. Source amnesia is another sort of memory error that can occur. This is when we attribute an event or information to the wrong source. Sometimes it's called source misattribution. This was demonstrated in an experiment with kindergarten kids done by Lindsay and Poole. They had a guy that they called Mr. Science, who came to the kindergarten class, and Mr. Science showed the kids how to blow up balloons with vinegar and baking soda. And I'm sure the parents really appreciated that. But anyways, he left, and then for the rest of that week, the teacher would read the kids stories about Mr. Science. In one of the stories, Mr. Science has a machine with ropes on it that could be pulled. A week later, after the kids had heard the stories, the researchers returned and asked the kids, what did Mr. Science do when he came? Did he have a machine with ropes on it? Many of the children firmly believe that Mr. Science indeed did bring a machine with ropes on it. In fact, he didn't. Where did they get that information? They got it from the stories the teacher had read. They experienced source amnesia. Now, you might think, well, that only happened to kids. But the reality is, it happens to adults as well. And one very striking example occurred in Australia. A woman was the victim of a sexual assault, and while the assault was occurring, a police psychologist was being interviewed live on television. The television was on. She reported the crime, and a little time later, the police believed that they had located the perpetrator of the assault, and so they asked her to come to the police station and identify that person who conducted the assault. And so in the police lineup, the psychologist who had been appearing on TV at the time the assault occurred was standing in the lineup. They needed some people to stand there, and the psychologist was around the police station. He said, yeah, sure, I'll stand there, you know. The lady looked at the people in the lineup and very quickly pointed to the police psychologist. There's the guy who did it. Now, in fact, he couldn't have done it. He was being interviewed live on TV at the time when this occurred. This was a case of source misattribution, source amnesia. In fact, someone else did it, but she associated the police psychologist with the assault because she was seeing him on TV at that time. So this does happen with adults as well. Now, some people wonder about, can children give a good account of events that they have witnessed? And children's eyewitness recall can be unreliable if leading questions are posed. If we direct the child to, if we ask them, did this happen? Did that happen? This can cause them to respond affirmatively that it did, can corrupt their memory of the event. Now that said, the same phenomenon applies to adults as well. Same thing can happen if we question adults using leading questions. This effect with children was illustrated by a study done by Cece and Brooke. And they interviewed 3-year-olds who had just received a routine pediatric examination of the genitals was not part of the exam, and in fact they had videos of the examinations to verify that that had not occurred. When the 3-year-olds exited the doctor's office, they gave them an anatomically correct doll, one that has all the parts on it. And then they asked the 3-year-olds one of 2 questions. Some 3-year-olds were asked, did the doctor touch you here? And the researcher pointed towards the genitals on the doll. 55% of those 3-year-olds believed that the doctor had touched them there, incorrectly remembered this. On the other hand, those children who were asked a different question, who were simply asked, where did the doctor touch you, rarely, not very often, would make that response. Their response was much more accurate. So, in fact, suggesting by leading questions to children that something happened can lead them to incorrectly remember events. However, if interviews are neutrally worded, then the accuracy of recall increases with children and also with adults for that matter. With children, if we must interview a child about an event that occurred, if they can be interviewed before adults who were involved in the incident can speak with them and potentially distort their memory of the event, then we're also more likely to get accurate information. When it comes to constructed memories, Loftus research shows that if false memories are implanted in people, they will construct memories consistent with that. And for example, children, it was suggested that maybe they got lost at the mall when in fact their parents had verified that they've never been lost in a mall. And children often came up then with elaborate stories about the event of being lost at the mall. So this is again a very common phenomenon. When suggested by an authority figure, people often will readily fabricate, come up with memories consistent with that. Now when we say fabricated, in fact they may have no conscious awareness that they're actually making up those details. Generally it's unconsciously they're complying with the suggestion to come up with a memory of this event that purportedly happened. Now this has some bearing on memories of abuse that are purported to have been repressed for a time and then later on recalled. Our memories of childhood abuse that the person did not have any awareness of, something that can be repressed and then remembered later, or are all of these memories of child abuse that come up years later a matter of constructed memories? Many psychotherapists used to believe that early childhood sexual abuse results in repressed memories, and so they would say that if a child has been sexually abused, that they're not going to have any recollection of it. On the other hand, experimental psychologists trying to produce repression under experimental conditions have failed to do so. So they have a different viewpoint. Their viewpoint is they're very skeptical that such memories could be repressed. And what research does, we have in terms of how people respond to frightening and very unpleasant events. In fact, generally, people remember those events all too well. Rather than repressing the event, they can't get it out of their mind. That's very typical from people who have been through, say, an auto accident, victim of a crime. They have an awareness that it happened, and in fact they wish they could forget, but it's all too well known to them. So repression, though, would be the person has no awareness the event ever happened. So what about potentially memories of child abuse that may have been repressed? Is there such a thing? Well, for one thing, here's some things we know about this. When people are abused in childhood, the responses to this are many and varied and greatly different from one person to another. So there's no survivor syndrome that everybody experiences when they've been abused, but we do know that people who have suffered child abuse are at increased risk of a wide range of problems. You name it: depression, anxiety, substance abuse problems, just about anything you can think of. But we can't simply look at the person and say, you got an anxiety problem or a depression problem, so you must have been abused as a child. Now, memories that are so-called recovered by suggestive techniques like hypnosis or guided imagery, or recovered under the influence of drugs, in fact, may be pseudo-memories. In fact, a therapist making such suggestions that the person must have been abused may actually then produce a false memory of abuse where none occurred. So we tend to be kind of skeptical about that, where this has been done. We want to really investigate very carefully whether that is an actual memory. Now, on the other hand, number 3, memories of abuse that are recovered spontaneously are more likely to be accurate memories of abuse than those that are therapeutically induced. So if the person is simply going about usually daily business and suddenly they begin remembering an incident of abuse, that's more likely to be something that really happened. We also know that specific memories of events and specific facts are not available to memory before around age 3. And why is that? Because the hippocampus matures much later in humans than the cerebellum, that accounts for motor skills and so forth. And so what we find is people really don't have memories of specific events and factual information that was gained before about 3 years of age. So if a person says, I remember that someone abused me, I was age 2 and I remember it vividly, we're going to say it's nearly impossible that that's an actual memory. Now that said, in fact, this could be accurate. In fact, if they learned about the abuse sometime later, okay, after they were 3 years of age, and then repress that memory for a time. That's possible, although the actual memory that they're recalling would be something that was an invented memory based on what they were told had happened. And that's the case for things where people think that they may remember something that happened before age 3. What we find out is generally that was based on some information they encountered. Like maybe the person says, oh, I think I remember that vacation trip that our family took when I was 1.5 years. In fact, where that memory probably came from is family members talked about that. Maybe they saw photos of the family, and so they invented a memory consistent with that. It's not an actual memory of the event. It's something that they put together. So whenever a person believes that they're remembering abuse that occurred before age 3, again, we're going to have to investigate very carefully. There may be something to it, but there's also a high likelihood that that's an invented memory of some sort. What we also have to realize is that memories of abuse, whether they're real or false, are emotionally upsetting, traumatic. And in fact, a false memory that the person believes to be true is just as traumatic as the real memory. Well, I don't know if I can say that. The real actual abuse may have caused other problems, but certainly a false memory of abuse is traumatic. So where therapists have falsely created memories of abuse that didn't occur, a person who was not an actual victim of abuse now has been traumatized by that action that caused that false memory. And innocent people also may be implicated by that false memory, so that can bring harm to those people. So any recovered memories of abuse need to be corroborated with other evidence, and particularly those that where there's a high likelihood of an invented memory. Now, just to finish up, just a few thoughts on improving memory. A few out of many that could be included. It's suggested that one study repeatedly to boost long-term recall. So more rehearsal of the information, and especially if it's spread over a longer period of time, distributed study, spaced study helps. Spending more time rehearsing information and actively thinking about it is important too. And if we can make the material we're learning personally meaningful, that connects it with more retrieval cues that are ourselves. So the more things that we know about, we can connect that knowledge with, the more examples that we can connect it with in our personal experience, the more likely we are to be able to recall that and use that information. And using mnemonic devices like the peg word system can help us, also connecting it with something we already have stored. Or we can make up a story that might include various elements that we need to remember. We can use chunking, such as acronyms, to remember lists of things that we'll need to recall later. And common rhymes can help us remember certain concepts like righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. That's one that helps you remember which way to turn bolts, right to tighten them and left to loosen them. Activating retrieval cues as well. Mentally recreating the situation and mood can help us recall information, even if we can't physically go there. If we can mentally recreate it, we may remember things that otherwise we wouldn't. And recalling events while they're fresh before we encounter misinformation can help. That's one of the reasons it's important to try and review your notes shortly after class, because then you're going to remember the things that you needed to fill in, and you can solidify things that were fuzzy before you get confused by other information. So highly recommended that you go over those notes shortly after class. Also, sleep's important. Sleep, we know, is a time when we consolidate memory, where long-term potentiation goes on most rapidly, and minimize interference. If we have to study two similar topics, try to do that on different semesters, or at least different days of the week. And if you can't do that, at least try to get one class in the morning and the other in the afternoon, rather than same part of the day. Also, testing our own knowledge is helpful. The testing effect indicates we'll do better if we've tested ourselves, and as we rehearse that information, we can determine what we don't yet know and spend additional time making sure we know that. There's some suggestions for you. So that wraps up the rest of the chapter on memory. Hopefully that was helpful to you. Don't forget to do that quiz, and that's it. Thanks.